Hello everyone, and thank you for joining. We're just setting up and should be ready to start in a few minutes. Bonjour à tous et merci de vous joindre à nous. Nous sommes en train de nous installer et devrions être prêts à démarrer dans quelques minutes. So welcome everyone, and thank you for joining. I meant to get it back on time, countering bias, promoting equality, and improving customer service through qualitative analysis of fines data. I'm Julie Morin from the Carl office, and I'm going to run through a few housekeeping items before we start. Participants have been muted upon entry. You may use the chat feature to bring technical difficulties to our attention or to share comments and resources. Our presenters will also be taking questions at the end, so you're encouraged to type your questions using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. Questions can be asked in French or English and can be translated by Carl staff if necessary. Finally, this webinar is being recorded and will be made available after the session. Slides have been posted in French and English on the Carl website. Links to these and the Carl Code of Conduct have been included at the beginning of the chat thread for your convenience. Nos présentatrices répondront aux questions à la fin. Vous êtes donc encouragés à taper vos questions en utilisant la fonction questions et réponses au bas de votre écran. Les questions peuvent être posées en français ou en anglais et peuvent être traduites par le personnel de la BRC si nécessaire. Ce webinaire est en cours d'enregistrement et sera disponible après la session. Les diapositives ont été publiées en français et en anglais sur le site web de la BRC. Des liens vers ceux-ci et le code de conduite de la BRC ont été inclus au début du fil de discussion. Without further ado, I invite Sharon Murphy, Associate University Librarian at the University of Alberta and member of Carl's Continuing Education Working Group, to introduce our speakers.
Thank you, Julie, and thanks to everyone for joining us today. This webinar was delivered last fall in a workshop version at the Canadian Library Assessment Workshop at the University of Windsor. We want to share it with you today because it was so very well received, and it was well received for several reasons. First of all, the subject is very close to our daily practice. Well, maybe not so much now during COVID times, but just think about the amount of time and energy and resources that we spend on administering fines and then on those fines appeals. We know that you're also going to find their methodology very interesting to learn about. But finally, and really the most important part of this is the lens of equity, diversity, and inclusion. that they bring to this study. We know that in these times, as we're all thinking about racial equality, about diversity and inclusivity, how important it is that we bring this lens into all of the work that we do. Bringing all of this today are two colleagues from Ryerson University, Lisa Levesque, who is the assessment librarian, and she's also a liaison librarian for journalism, RTA media, and communications and culture, and Kelly Kimberly, who is head of borrowing and lending services. And so Lisa and Kelly, over to you.
Well, thanks very much for that lovely introduction. And thank you everyone for joining us today for I Meant to Get It Back on Time. So first I'll just go through our agenda quickly. We're going to talk about who we are and why we did the study. We'll spend a fair bit of time going through the methodology that we used. And then we should have enough time to discuss the results and offer discussion to everyone that's joined us today. So cultivating a culture of assessment within my department has been a great and rewarding experience. Back in late 2018, Lisa reached out to me to support my desire to eliminate excessive library fines. Lisa suggested that if we looked at the last 5 years of data, we could make the argument that the decreasing circulation of physical items meant fines were a decreasing source of revenue, and therefore were not worth the contentious relationship with our patrons or the cost of the staff time needed to administer the fines. This was a successful argument that was approved by Library Management Group, and then by March of 2019, we were able to gain approval from University Finance to modernize our fine structure. I started reading through all of the fines appeals being submitted and realized that there was some really rich qualitative data there about the student experience. This led to Lisa and I continuing to work together and share student and faculty voices on why library fines are so problematic for them. This led us to gain an understanding of how equity must be considered in this conversation about library fines. So at Ryerson, we strive for the fair and just treatment of all community members through the creation of opportunities and the removal of barriers to address historic and current disadvantages for underrepresented and marginalized groups. Lisa will discuss a little further.
Thanks, Kelly. And thank you, Julie and Sharon, for that lovely introduction. Yeah, so because equity is a major focus at Ryerson University, it's also a major focus of the library, and we're able to work on assessment projects that really kind of relate to equity or allow us to look into equity issues. So here, there's a link to our previous year's assessment plans that list out some of the projects that we work on this topic. This spring, unfortunately, we have to move it further into the future because of the pandemic. We were going to look at the accessibility of our space. But in the past, we've done projects like that. We've looked at, we did a research study where we asked students about their research processes, and they kind of told us about everything involved in research that ties in with their lived experience. We've asked students through town halls about sort of equity related issues like textbook purchasing, things like that. So as Kelly mentioned, we had done this quantitative work where we'd looked at decreasing circulation, decreasing fine revenue, and Kelly had made the really fantastic argument that, this is, from her experience, a really negative sort of customer service environment that's created because of it. We also looked at the literature on fines, and we found that really, really interesting. So from doing our review, we find that fines affect some individuals more than others. They can be a deterrent to library use. And this really widely held belief that fines are effective at getting people to return their materials doesn't have evidence, right? So that's kind of a prejudice that we hold as a profession. So we were really interested to look into this more, given what we learned in the literature, which is really interesting, but there wasn't a lot of sort of solid studies that showed this, using the fine appeal data, which Kelly had been looking at, and which, as she said, is a really rich source of evidence.
So Fines are very troubling when one of your departmental goals is to deliver customer service excellence. There's a lot of time-consuming back and forth between the staff and the patron, and nobody ever wins. Staff don't like being the enforcer. Patrons rarely appreciate why we don't see their point of view and waive the fine. Lisa remembered this Seinfeld clip that probably still reflects how many patrons still perceive libraries employees.
Yeah, so the literature shows that fines are old-fashioned, moralizing, and pedantic. And when I read that, I couldn't help but think about the Seinfeld sketch with Mr. Bookman, the book detective, who tracks down Jerry because Jerry has a 20-year overdue book, right? And it's funny, I encourage you to go watch the video after this presentation because we could all use a laugh these days. But you know, the source of the humor is that fines are very serious business. And that was kind of a fun, stuffy old idea 30 years ago when this aired in 1991 on Seinfeld, right? So yeah, Mr. Bookman is a really funny character, but we don't necessarily want to be the enforcer, be the penalizer, or have this stuffy, pedantic persona associated with us as library workers.
So I'm pleased to share that Ryerson Library no longer levies fines against our lower circulating regular loans like books and DVDs and periodicals. It felt wrong to place a financial burden on students and even instructors, knowing the item is just going back to sit on the shelf. If a book is being used, why would we ever interrupt that? Once an item is recalled, however, a fine is issued if the item is not returned in a timely fashion. The recall ensures that the resources are shared amongst those that need them. So upon examination, we discovered that many fines were no longer serving our needs, and we've since been able to reduce the fines on items that were once high demand, like DVD players and VHS tapes, to a nominal fee. Our new approach takes feedback from our patrons into account. We only fine when absolutely necessary, which includes high demand items like textbooks, emerging technology, laptops, and course reserves. Freeing up staff time from the labor-intensive task of collecting fines provides much needed staff time to circulate popular student draws such as emerging technology and textbooks. If we believe that the one-on-one interactions at the circulation desk have value, engage the students, and create community, eliminating needless fines is a necessary step to improve relations and change the dynamic between patrons and our staff. So fines are a contentious issue for both library workers and patrons. This tweet posted on the anonymous grievance bot LIS Grievances is a good example of how our library staff sometimes feel. So I'll waive every fine forever on the condition that I never have to hear another sob story about why checking your email is impossible.
All right, so we've now just sort of introduce the qualitative study that we ran with some of the results that we did come up with, right? And brought in our own personal experiences, as Kelly has as the head of borrowing and lending services, about the negative effect of fines on staff and patrons, right? But when we were conducting our study, our first sort of goal setting out was to think about bias and try to be transparent about it in order to eliminate it where possible, or to design our study in order to be objective, right? And this is a major concern for all assessment activities. Our study was not any more prone to bias than any other one is, right? It's a major issue you always have to address. If you don't address it, bias will seep in. So our question was, how can we think about bias, assess our bias, and then put it to the side so that we don't prejudice our results? So relevant types of bias that we were kind of thinking about were confirmation bias, knowing that this policy change to adjust fines was in place or about to happen. We conducted our study in the summer of 2019, and then the change was implemented in the fall. So we were in process. We did not want to confirm the results. We wanted to be completely open to what the data had to tell us. There's also the bias caused by personal and professional experience, right? So our experience as as employees, at sort of a social justice focused university, as frontline workers, as librarians who are embedded in a culture that views fines in a particular way, and then as patrons ourselves, right? We all use the public library in our own library, and we feel a certain way about fines. So let's get that out and on the table. And then some of our, emotional biases that of course are going to be there. Kelly and I have both been liaison librarians and had relationships with students. Flora, our other research partner, works in circulation. Kelly works in circulation now. And so you develop relationships with students and with instructors, and you, of course, think about it in an emotional manner. Sorry, that was my phone. Okay, so what did we do in order to reduce our bias once we had thought about it? So the first thing we did was just kind of get everything on the table, right? Talk about that, have our discussions about what we thought about fines, what our concerns were. Then when we actually started analyzing the data, we use methods from grounded theory, which is a methodology specifically designed for qualitative research that's designed to address subjectivity. Right? So one of those was the constant comparative method, which is a specific method you can use for analysis. And if you're interested in getting an overview of grounded theory, I recommend this book by Denscombe, The Good Research Guide. It gives a really good practical overview of how to conduct small-scale research projects. And then we divided the work evenly between us when we were doing our analysis, and then we'd come together to have these conversations and kind of surface what we were thinking about, directions we might go in, results that might be emerging from the data. And that was really helpful for making sure that our analysis was grounded in the data and shared so that it wasn't Lisa's interpretation or Kelly's interpretation. Instead, it was really from the data itself. Okay, so the research questions that we were working on were, why do patrons appeal fines? That one's really closely tied into the data that we're working with. It's fine appeal data. But then from that, we were able to look at the second question, why do patrons incur fines? And that one we were able to do because the majority of fine appeals have to do with why the patron got the fine in the first place. So our data source was the fine appeal form, which is linked on the library website, and all data sources have strengths and weaknesses. So we evaluated that and thought about it a lot during our process, right? So for a weakness, fine appeals are a small subset of fine incursions. Far more people incur fines than ever appeal it. A reason for that could be that not everyone knows about the fine appeal form, and not everyone maybe feels compelled to do that. They might feel comfortable paying a fine, be able to pay it, which means that in our sample data, we might get slightly more people who feel that their fine was unjust or can't pay it, right? There's also the potential tendency for exaggeration that we kind of talked about when we were discussing bias. I skipped ahead to this a little before, but I'm going back to it now. So this is a great photo from the Archives of Ontario that shows a grandmother. The image label is Bubby. And I bring it up because, it's kind of a joke that grandmothers pass away at an alarming rate around exams, right? So students, particularly not so much instructors, will maybe falsify information sometimes when they're appealing a fine. And we talked about this at length, and we found that it was not particularly helpful to divide students in our mind into bad students who maybe lied or exaggerated things, and then good students who tried their best to pay the fine or ran into an issue, right? We have to kind of take the data at face value, especially because then it allows us to really draw on one of the strengths, which is that it's a really rich source of data. People are telling us about their experiences as researchers, as students, what it's like for them. And a lot of the time in the data, they were telling us they wanted us to listen. Please listen. Please change your policies sometimes. And they would share really personal information with us, right? They want us to hear about their lives, which can include times when maybe a family member passes away. Another strength of this data source is that it allows us to do secondary data analysis, which reduces survey fatigue. So instead of sending out a survey and asking patrons, hey, how did you feel about those fines that we charged you? We already have all of that data readily available for us. We aren't exhausting our patrons with additional questions. And yeah, it's on hand, it's easy to use, it reduces the amount of time we have to spend collecting that sort of data. Bobby. All right, so I'm gonna go over this really quickly. If you have any specific questions about the software, email me, I'm happy to answer questions. But just briefly, we use Google Sheets for the data collection, initial cleanup, and collaborative coding. We use OpenRefine to shape the data, and we use Tableau for data visualization. And we chose these because they allow collaboration and because they're freely available, which means that if any other librarians want to run a study like this, the tools are available for you, and most likely the data is available for you if you already collect fine appeals. Okay, so we analyzed 404 appeals in all. Fine appeals could be coded more than once, which is why we end up having more as a coded category. We did 50 for sort of historic back years, and then we did 257 appeals for the most recent year of data. Why did we do that? To see if there was any difference from year to year. There was not. Spoiler alert for those results. All right, so that's an overview of our methods. Now here are the results and what we found. Okay, so here is a chart. It's a stacked bar chart that shows the codes for all of the appeals that we looked at. So we have cause, which is the predominant sort of result. People told us why they got the fine, why the fine is a problem, or the effect of the fine on patrons. And then financial difficulty ended up being such an important category that we coded those results entirely on their own. All right, so the top reason that people incurred fines was that a mistake happened. So that's the large column over to the left here. So that is divided into the subcodes of patron, library, and general. So an example with a patron would be, I locked my book in my locker, right? A really small mistake happened. A library example might be, you did not send me a notification that my book was overdue, which really interesting to be on a research team with people who do different work within the library, because that's where I think Flora had kind of mentioned, yeah, that doesn't necessarily happen with our ILS system, but it's a small mistake that can be kind of easily blamed on the library, and it's okay. And then general, just some other small mistake. So this category is similar in nature to the other category shown here in the darkest blue of other life circumstances. So that would be another small mistake or circumstance, but of a more serious nature. So for instance, someone might say, I was assaulted on my way to the library, and that's why my resources were late. Moving and working are major categories here. As anyone who's ever moved knows, it's incredibly disruptive. And then working, you know, we work at Ryerson University Library, which was formerly a polytechnic. It's now a research university, but it's still very experiential learning focused. A lot of people do placements. A lot of people are entrepreneurs. So it makes perfect sense that a lot of people are working, right? Our students are working. Also specific to Ryerson perhaps is travel, right? We are located in a downtown of, the downtown of, you know, the largest city in Canada. Traveling to and from school can be difficult sometimes. We're a commuter campus. And then we have coded separately here for international. A number of our students have international ties with their family or are international students. All right, and then the other ones that I haven't mentioned here, I'm going to talk a little bit more in detail in the next slides. The only other one I want to mention, I guess, is system critique. And that's those fines appeals where students told us specifically, this is unfair, or this is not a great practice for you to be doing. Great. So I have included a link here to the code book where we list out the descriptions and inclusion, exclusion criteria for each code. I find code books fascinating, but I understand not everyone does. So please check this out at your leisure. But here's kind of an example of what it would look like. So for health as a category, we would code for physical or mental health if it was specifically indicated in the fine appeal. Often it wasn't, so we'd code under general, because if someone said, I went to the hospital, we can't know if it was, you know, a physical or mental ailment that took them there. And then we have examples from the data, right? So my mental health was negative and I had a medical condition flare up. Okay, so as a result from what we saw from this data, fine appeals exist on a spectrum. So our patrons are people with full lives beyond just their academic lives. And if there's a reason that we really want to share this, it's to kind of, you know, spread the idea that we have to look at the full lived experience of people that we're trying to help serve. As librarians, sometimes we can be a little focused on the library, right? The library is the most important thing, which it is, but also sometimes people have other things going on. And we would really see a huge spectrum of appeals from I've locked my books in my locker to I've had a family member suffer a major medical issue, right? Everything from kind of the mundane to the very serious and life-changing. And during the analysis, we talked about the metaphor of bandwidth for why sometimes patrons might incur fines when they're overwhelmed, right? So if you have a family member who has a serious, you know, mental health issue or something going on, you don't have the capacity to focus on other things like your library fines, and those kind of fall off the table. So in this example, someone had written to us about just that. They said they were dealing with personal physical health issues and the mental health of a family member. And so they appealed on the basis that I'm hoping you can understand that sometimes life hits you all at once, and I'm trying to handle it. We were also kind of thinking about the fact that some people have more bandwidth than others, right? We don't all have the same time and energy to devote to our academic lives at all times. Okay, so the second most common reason that someone appealed a fine was because they had gotten it for an academic reason. And this is very interesting because this is sort of counterintuitive to the reason that the library exists, right? We want to help people do research and give them access to research materials. So from the literature, critics of fines have argued that fines limit access to library resources. It's contrary to the purpose of a library to charge fines. And there's some evidence that students are more motivated by due dates than by fines. So we kind of found that reflected here. Yeah. And just really kind of thinking about that, when patrons would tell us about their academic needs for something, we want them to be engaged with the materials. We want them to be involved in deep reading, and we want them to have, you know, quality time with the research materials. So this slide, I think, shows a little bit more of that, but also maybe another interesting reason to look at fine appeals. So here we have two pie charts side by side, and these are fine appeals by resource type. Overall, if we look at the ILS data for fines, laptop fines are a very small percentage of the overall data. About 5% of fines come in because of someone is using a laptop. But here, we really see that they are commonly a cause of fine appeals. So they're the second most common reason for all codes. And then for academic appeals, they're the most commonly used item, right? So what we really have is an overrepresentation in the data of students appealing, or students and instructors maybe appealing laptops compared to other items. A potential reason for that is that our loan period used to be quite short for laptops. It was 2 hours. It is now 8 hours. And at the time when it was 2 hours, because a laptop takes a little while to boot up, a patron would borrow a laptop, take it away, begin their work, get into the flow of researching, and then their time would be up and they'd have to return it. It would inevitably be late, and then they would have to appeal the fine, right? So looking at this kind of shows that that practice was not working. Okay, so a major category that emerged from the results was financial difficulty. So this is when patrons would say, I cannot afford to pay a fine. We assumed from the data, because these are fine appeals, everyone writing in did not want to pay a fine. So we only coded for really specific instances when they talked about financial difficulty, duress, or having financial burdens. What's interesting to note here is that patrons would often talk about library fines in connection to the cost of student life generally. So they'd group us in with tuition, OSAP, childcare, and kind of tell us, as this person did here, that being a student is already financially tough without having fines on top of that. Here I have a table that shows some comparison numbers for all codes that were marked as financial difficulty, and then all other codes from the data set. And what I want to show here is that really the averages are not very different. Overall, the numbers are not different for the amounts that people had to pay for these fines that they were appealing. But that's because expenses are relative. When we start thinking about financial difficulty, we're thinking about what one person can afford versus another person. It's not about equality. Everyone has to pay the same $10. That $10 is a lot more expensive for one person than for another. Okay, and then finally, we found that some types of fines are more expensive than others. So when we looked at the codes broken down by category, we found that it's much more expensive generally to get a fine because of a family issue or a health issue. So these are just two comparison bar charts. On the left, we have cost. On the right, we have number of records. And I did, of course, go through the data and make sure there was no underlying reason for this. It wasn't that there was an expensive fine in that category that adjusted the average. This is a good representation of just people were paying more in general if they had a family issue or a health issue. So of course that is inequitable, but we can also think about who that's likely to affect, right? So people who have family concerns are more likely perhaps to have dependents, like children or dependent parents. They might be mature students. And we know that women still carry on the majority of child and home care, despite advances that we've made in the workplace. If you'd like support on that topic, there are a few good Statistics Canada reports that show that. Then thinking about health. So people who are more likely to be affected by health concerns on a regular basis include people with chronic health issues, people with ongoing mental health issues, and people with disabilities, right? So we are, by charging fines across the board, we are more likely to cause additional duress to those people.
So looking back at the fall of 2019, when we were in full swing implementing changes to our fines policy, my main reflection is that it surely took a village that I am so grateful to have shared this experience with. Staff patiently used their customer service skills and manual workarounds while awaiting updates to be made in Sierra. Our intrepid cataloging librarian and Sierra guru, Trina, worked with technician Flora to make the changes within the circulation module. That was no small effort. Both engaged in a series of training sessions with Innovative to gain the necessary skills. Staff were absolutely uplifted by the experience of waiving fines and even reassuring students that no fines would accrue was a really new one. Some staff had been enforcing fines for over 25 years, and the relief was palpable. For the students, I am confident that they felt that we heard them, that we were listening to their individual stories. Even when an employee would say, "No worries, I'm able to waive your fine," students would still continue to share the circumstances that caused them to return the materials late. And now we find ourselves working off-site, trying to imagine how we fit in this purported new normal as we cope as best we can while working through a global pandemic. I surely don't have any solutions, but like many of us, I'm finding a way day by day. At Ryerson, at least, the rapid-fire decision-making that happened as we closed winter 2020 while working from home was made a little easier by the fact that staff had already made the mental shift away from attaching their value to enforcing fines. We are physically closed. Staff are working off-site with no ability to process fines payments. All fines payments have been deferred until September 2020, possibly longer. Fines had the potential to be a barrier to students that were graduating and those trying to register for classes. The big picture thinking that was served up by the pandemic made it easy to see that students needed support and not punitive measures. Once we are back on site, it will still take more time before the campus is open to students. We are working to re-envision what our services and spaces will look like as we implement safety measures. Many of our faculties are still quite tied to the physical resources, and I have a faith that we will find a way, but a new way. Equity, of course, remains top of mind. As a department head, I rely on my staff to keep me apprised of the issues students and instructors are facing as they bravely continue their course of study at Ryerson. Okay, and now we are available for discussion. If you have any questions that you'd like to ask Lisa or myself.
Lisa and Kelly. So just to remind you, you can type your questions in the Q&A feature below, and if that doesn't work, you can also type them into the chat. I'll monitor both. I see that Justine has her hand up. I'll guess I'll allow her to talk. Hold on a second. Hi, Justine. You should be able to ask a question now. I'm just gonna ask her to unmute.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
First of all, thank you for the presentation. Super interesting. I really enjoyed it. I'm wondering if you are, now that you've done this, if you are thinking of taking an equity lens to another issue in the library, and if so, what that issue would be.
I would say that we certainly are considering how equity impacts all of our students. I can talk about an issue right now, which is the pandemic made us discover exactly how many students don't have devices that they can effectively use productivity software on. They don't have stable connections to the internet. They definitely don't have connections that allow someone to do e-learning and stream. So we very quickly whipped out a what we hope is a hardship-based system of providing folks with laptops and with Wi-Fi hotspots, and we ship them out across the province. So I can honestly say that equity is a very rewarding place to start when you're considering any of your services.
Thank you.
Thank you, Justine.
All right.
I can comment on that too.
Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, we certainly plan projects. So I write an annual assessment project every year, which kind of builds on the previous year's successes and the goals for the coming year. And I always I find it very helpful, and it allows me to kind of look at the plan for the year and go, okay, where are we thinking about equity? What groups are we going to consult? You know, how are we balancing our inquiries so we're not just entirely focused on, let's say, one group or one area. We're looking at collections, we're looking at space, we're looking at everything, and hopefully bringing in an equity lens whenever that's appropriate. Things that I'm specifically really excited for right now, I hope to learn more about research methods that really kind of focus the equity lens, right? So Indigenous research methodologies are on my mind. I'm thinking about anti-oppressive frameworks. I'm currently a member of the Data Feminism reading group, which is really fantastic, and they have all of their videos online. I really recommend checking it out and reading that book. So Data Feminism is about data science from a feminist perspective, and it's very inclusive. So they include librarians, they include artists, they include people who aren't traditionally trained in computer science.
Thanks, Lisa.
Thank you.
Okay, we have a few more questions that have come in. You talked a lot about students. Did faculty also appeal fines, and did you look at their data separately from students? If so, were there patterns in the faculty members' appeals similar to or different from student appeals?
Well, maybe I'll just comment on that, and then if Lisa has something further to add. One thing I'll say is that at Ryerson, faculty is an interesting term. So we have quite a number of people that are teaching at Ryerson that are part of the CUPE union and are instructors, but not members of the faculty association. But we did certainly get, you know, over the years, we've always had faculty that felt that fines were, you know, they shouldn't be directed at them because they're employees of the university. But more often than not, we also saw instructors that were in fact experiencing hardship, regardless of their elevated status as an instructor. And they would share their experience with us and ask the fines be waived as well.
Yeah. I'll mention, yeah, perhaps I said students a few times when I really meant patrons. We did take a sort of an overall view because from the fine appeals, we did not always know if the person was a student or an instructor. And the context might be similar sometimes, right? If someone was trapped on the TTC, Toronto's transit system, you know, your sort of level at the university is kind of irrelevant. I think with instructors, we did see a few issues related to travel. So being in a different city, having to commute, you know, if you're precariously employed as a CUPE instructor, you might take a job elsewhere or not know where you're going to be the next semester. So we did see that.
Okay, next question. What type of resistance to this change did you face, and how did you handle it?
Well, this was a change that I had been interested in for several years. And maybe this is a plug to connect with your local assessment librarian, because in any of the arguments that I had put forth prior to engaging Lisa on this topic really didn't hold water. Once I had Lisa involved and we were able to show through the data that this was of benefit to the university and moreover benefit to our patrons, it all went really smoothly.
Yeah. Well, I think in the past, right? So, you know, we think about fines as it's an old-fashioned practice. And so looking at the data, you are able to say, yeah, this doesn't really make sense anymore. Fine revenue that went to the library or, you know, divided between the library and university might have been compelling at one point, but it just is not coming in at the same level that it used to, that's really a barrier for us anyway. I mean, it might be a barrier for larger library institutions or places where you bring in more fines. But even then, you know, because we were able to see in our results that inequity existed, I would question the reliance on that as a revenue source.
Mm-hmm. And times have changed too. I mean, our patrons, I would say they're not customers, but we do need to consider, you know, customer service practices when we're dealing with our patrons.
Okay, we have a few more questions in the chat. Did you find that students kept their loans past due dates more often after fines were removed?
So one of the things that we did in conjunction with this was we did change all of our loan periods. So with the extended loan periods, students had more than enough time to use the materials, and we didn't find that things were going past their due dates. I think our change basically reflects the idea that the material should be due back when the student is finished with it versus when the due date says, you know.
Beautiful answer. I have nothing to add.
So I'm just seeing one more question. It would be interesting to understand who appeals and who doesn't. What other factors are at play?
Yeah. Well, oh, go ahead, Kelly.
One of the things that has caused me some worry is, you know, Lisa and I talked really in-depthly about this concept of bandwidth. And it occurs to me that even to make the fine appeal, you need to have enough bandwidth to make the fine appeal. So I have concern for people that couldn't pay the fine, that it may have been taking, you know, their dinner from them that night, and they still didn't have, you know, all the pieces that were necessary to do a fine appeal. So yeah, that is a concern.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm thinking about the concept of bandwidth a lot these days. Working from home during the pandemic,
yeah.
You know, your mental state is different, and it's good to acknowledge that it has to be different because you're dealing with stress and reading the news and thinking about different concerns, and so your priorities shift. You know, one thing that we heard from staff, so Kelly and I presented this a few times at Ryerson Library after we'd completed the study, just anecdotal, but from people that work on the front lines, is that sometimes patrons who had the means to pay fines easily when they were taking out an item, maybe like a high use item like a reserve book, would calculate at that moment how much their fine would be because they would want to return it at a time that was convenient for them. Mm-hmm. So they would look at the fine table and say, oh yeah, I can afford to pay that. Right? So we would not receive any fine appeals from those people because the fine becomes a cost to them that they accept. But that, of course, disadvantages other students in their class who can't use that reserve item.
Okay, well, I'm not seeing any more questions. Was there anything else, Lisa or Kelly, that you wanted to add before we close?
Just thanking everyone for being here. It's a nice change of pace to all of the, you know, returning to campus, curbside talk. So it's nice to reflect back on this work.
Okay.
Yeah, no, it's nice to reflect back on it, to think about it. You know, maybe there are opportunities for people to think about this while we're in this different state. And I know fines are temporarily suspended at a lot of locations. I guess the only other thing I'd add is if you want to know any specifics about using Tableau or the mechanics of our methods, send us an email.
All right, if there are no further questions, on behalf of Carl, I'd like to thank our presenters for this excellent presentation and all of our participants for attending. Recording should be available shortly, and we ask that you keep an eye out for upcoming webinars and community calls in our series. Have a great week, everyone. Passez une bonne semaine.
Thanks, everyone.